Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and in this video I will continue my conversation about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is going to be the last video conversation on Chapter 2, starting from page 81 to 86. So we'll be concluding Chapter 2. As always, I will first go and read parts of the chapter and then come back and talk to you about it. If you are new to this series, I highly recommend that you should watch all the other videos in this series before coming to this one, and you can see it up there and click on it and watch the previous videos. Now, I've also discovered a new resource online which I wish I had discovered earlier, and it's a website called History is a Weapon, and they have the full annotated text of Pedagogy of the Oppressed on their website, and I've used that text today on in my reading, and the link to that website is in the description. Please do look it up. They have all other resources as well. And the reason I like this resource is because one thing that I always have problem with is in translating citations and direct quotes which are in other languages, because I don't know those languages. But what these people have done is, if you hover over a cited part of the text, as you will see in my reading, it gives you a translation of the French text into English or Spanish or Portuguese text. So I think that's a really great resource to find them on the web and use them. So as always, I'll read, but here is a brief summation of what's going on. This part of the chapter is mostly about the problem solving or problem posing system of education. This is where Freire is introducing his method of teaching the problem-posing system of education. It is still in comparison to the banking system, remember, because the banking system is the dominant system against which he's offering that. But in this chapter, in this section, at least the theoretical aspects of the problem-posing system of education become very clear. Hence the title of this video being the problem-posing education. So here, without holding it much longer, let's go and read and then come back and talk about it. Anesthetizes and inhibits creative power. Problem-posing education involves a constant unveiling of reality. The former attempts to maintain the submersion of consciousness. The latter strives for the emergence of consciousness and critical intervention in reality. Students, as they are increasingly posed with problems relating to themselves in the world and with the world, will feel increasingly challenged and obliged to respond to that challenge, because they apprehend the challenge as interrelated to other problems within a total context, not as a theoretical question. The resulting comprehension tends to be increasingly critical and thus constantly less alienated. Their response to the challenge evokes new challenges followed by new understandings, and gradually the students come to regard themselves as committed. Education as the practice of freedom, as opposed to education as the practice of domination, denies that man is abstract, isolated, independent, and unattached to the world. It also denies that the world exists as a reality apart from people. Authentic reflection considers neither abstract man nor the world without people, but people in their relations with the world. In these relations, consciousness and world are simultaneous. Consciousness neither precedes the world nor follows it. And here is a quote from Sartre, and this app allows me to translate it. Consciousness and the world are given in one blow. Essentially external to consciousness, the world is essentially relative to it. In one of our culture circles in Chile, the group was discussing, based on a codification, the anthropological concept of culture. In the midst of the discussion, a peasant who by banking standard was completely ignorant, said, "Now I see that the earth without man there is no world." Now I see that without man there is no world. When the educator responded, let's say for the sake of argument that all men on earth were to die, but the earth itself remained together with trees, birds, animals, rivers, seas, the stars. Wouldn't all this be a world? Oh no, the peasant replied emphatically, there would be no one to say this is a world. The peasant wished to express the idea that there would be lacking the consciousness of the world, which necessarily implies the world of consciousness. I cannot exist without a non-I. In turn, the not-I depends on that existence. The world which brings consciousness into existence becomes the world of that consciousness. Hence the previously cited affirmation of Sartre. Consciousness and the world are given of a same shot. So here we are moving into a clear-cut understanding of what he calls the problem-posing or problem-solving education in opposition to the banking system. And if you look at the very first passage I started with, what he says is that while the banking system inhibits creative power, right, the problem-posing system actually encourages it. How does it inhibit creative power? Because most of the effort in the banking system is placed in mastering the knowledge that is being passed down to you and then reproducing it, right? So there is no creativity involved in it. The students are not allowed to even infuse that knowledge with their own experiential information. They are just there to reproduce it. That's why it inhibits creativity. Now, this is not just some backwater little town, in Argentina. This happens in universities as well. Remember, I talked about the discourse of the master. Even at doctoral level of education, let's say in literary studies, if all we tell our students that these are the texts that you need to read for your specialization, there are criticisms of it, but master these, but discourage them to think the field itself anew, right? We are then inhibiting critical thinking and replacing it with this comprehension of the field itself, but within the limits that the field sets itself. So critical education then involves, first of all, understanding that knowledge is being shared in reality, right? And that one ought to start thinking critically to intervene in reality, right? And the banking system absolutely doesn't permit for that. The next that he goes into is then is the questions are problem-posing education, right? So if we offer what we are teaching as a set of problems to be solved together by the teacher and the student, right, then the students get into the habit of looking at a problem, criticizing it, looking at it critically, and relating it to their own lived experience, right? And in the process then learn of the reality itself. How is it constructed? Why do the things mean the way they mean? And hence that, in his view, is connected to freedom. Now, there is a sentence there where he says that problem-posing education neither sees the world as abstract nor is about defining human beings in the abstract. So human beings are contingent. They live in the world, right? The question here is of consciousness. How does it emerge? So this is where he's now going using Husserl, right? The question of the intending subject is very prominent here. So first of all, you cannot come to consciousness in isolation as individual. So those mythologies of individual fighting for freedom and all is not going to work, because one aspect in which the banking system is crucial in defining who we are is by abstracting us from the world, by making us to think that we are all alone. No. Problem-posing education encourages solidarity. You work to understand the problem in a classroom and hence learn to understand the world collaboratively with other individuals. And you don't think that either the world creates consciousness or consciousness creates the world, which is Husserlian, but that consciousness and the world come together simultaneously, right? We know of the world because we are in it, but we know of it because we are conscious of it. The world then becomes what our consciousness makes it so. That's Phenomenology 101, right? But that people are aware of it, right? So when he gives us the example of the peasant, now that's, I don't know, did I read that in this paragraph? But I'll talk about it, and if I didn't read it, I'll come back to it. So the example of the peasant that he's giving while they were discussing the anthropological concept of culture, the anthropological concept of the culture comes in 1920s, which presupposes that culture, right, is a combination of different things, but all involve human presence in it, right? Because culture in that sense is mastery of nature, right? So that practical example, right, what the peasant is saying and what the question is posed is and this is someone who would otherwise be considered ignorant, right? When the question is posed to him, what would it be if you and I didn't exist in the world? Would it still be a world? And his idea is the world is the world because we intend it, right? If we are not there to say it, who would know, right? In Urdu, we say, Jungle mein mor nacha kisne dekha, right? When the peacock, dances in the forest, if no one sees it, what's the point, right? It doesn't exist. So that's why that reference to that I need a not I to define myself. But without me, the not I can itself does not exist. So there is this correspondence between consciousness and reality, right? And that is why he goes back to Sartre with this famous quote from Jean-Paul Sartre that consciousness and reality are produced simultaneously. One doesn't produce the other. They are there in the world together. Okay. So to sum up this reading then, while the banking system inhibits any critical thinking of the text itself, of the object of study we have already learned, but of our place in the world. How do we understand it, right? The problem-posing educational system enables the students to think the world critically. Why? Because in the process of collectively solving a problem, a math problem, a class assignment, what they're also constantly learning is that we live in the world. Things are contingent, right? But they also develop a habit of thinking critically about what is being taught, about the object of study. And that is the first step towards thinking about the world critically. But also knowing that no one needs to teach us the idea that we live in the world. Our existence, our consciousness is related to the world, right? That is something that we already know, right? The question is not inhibiting that. Now, a side note here, what he's calling the problem-solving or problem-posing education, of course, eventually would become critical pedagogy. That's the term that is used right now. And of course, if you've watched my other lectures, you will know about it. So I'm going to stop here about talking about this part of the reading, go and read a little more, and then come and talk about it. As women and men simultaneously reflecting on themselves and on the world increase the scope of their perception, they begin to direct their observations towards previously inconspicuous phenomena. And this is a quote from Husserl, and I read, "In perception properly so called as an explicit awareness, I am turned towards the object, to the paper for instance. I apprehend it as being this here and now. The apprehension is a signaling out every object having a background in experience. Around and about the paper lie books, pencils, inkwell, and so forth, and these in a certain sense are also perceived, perceptually there in the field of intuition. But whilst I was turned towards the paper, there was no turning in their direction, nor any apprehending of them, not even in a secondary sense. They appeared and yet were not singled out, were not posited on their own account. Every perception of a thing has such a zone of background intuitions or background awareness. If intuiting already includes the state of being turned towards, and this also is a conscious experience, or more briefly, a consciousness of all, indeed, that in point of fact lies in the co-perceived objective background. End of quote. That which had existed objectively but had not been perceived in its deeper implications, if it was perceived at all, begins to stand out, assuming the character of a problem and therefore of challenge. Thus, men and women begin to single out elements from their background awareness and to reflect upon them. These elements are now objects of their consideration and as such objects of their action and cognition. In problem-posing education, people develop their power to perceive critically the way they exist in the world with which and in which they find themselves. They come to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality in process, in transformation. Although the dialectical relations of women and men with the world exist independently of how these relations are perceived, or whether or not they are perceived at all, it is also true that the form of action they adopt is to a large extent a function of how they perceive themselves in the world. Hence, the teacher-student and the student-teachers reflect simultaneously on themselves and the world without dichotomizing this reflection from action, and thus establish an authentic form of thought and action. Once again, the two educational concepts and practices under analysis come into conflict. Banking education, for obvious reason, attempts by mythicizing reality to conceal certain facts which explain the way human beings exist in the world. Problem-posing education sets itself the task of demythologizing. Banking education resists dialogue. Problem-posing education regards dialogue as indispensable to the act of cognition which unveils reality. Banking education treats students as objects of assistance. Problem-posing education makes them critical thinkers. Banking education inhibits creativity and domesticates, although it cannot completely destroy the intentionality of consciousness by isolating consciousness from the world, thereby denying people their ontological and historical vocation of becoming more fully human. Problem-posing education bases itself on creativity and stimulates true reflection and action upon reality, thereby responding to the vocation of persons as being who are authentic only when engaged in inquiry and creative transformation. In sum, banking theory and practice, as immobilizing and fixating forces, fail to acknowledge men and women as historical beings. Problem-posing theory and practice take the people's historicity as their starting point. So there is a lot going on in these passages. Okay, so first of all, we're talking about the problem-posing education, and since it encourages people to reflect, men and women to reflect on the object of study, but also the world around it, that gives them the habit of critical thinking. That's why he's going to Husserl. That complex passage that we just read from Husserl, all it means is that in the process of perception, absence becomes part of the perception. Even though I am looking at the object that I must have intended, you, but I'm also constantly aware of intuitively things that are behind my back. I always use this example in order to explain how absence is present in our perception. Now when I show this to you, this is a book, right? You know it, you perceive it, you intend it. But if I show you this, even though you cannot see this part, this part, this part, you only see a spine. The reason you still think of a book and perceive this as a book is because these absences are part of your perception, right? So what he's saying is that most of the time we human beings live in the world and make sense of it and live in it with this intuitive knowledge of the larger structures in which we exist. And the only reason we don't think critically of those is because the educational system or the system of belief doesn't encourage us to. So what does it lead to? Fatalism. We resign to our location in the world as we are. So when women and men, they simultaneously reflect on themselves and on the world, when we take away that dichotomy of self and the world, then those objective, intuitive truths that surround them start factoring in their thinking the world, right? And the problem-posing education is the one that enables them to do that. The banking system would detach them from the world and tell them, here, learn these skills and you will be successful, right? That's all we are teaching them. So hence we're not teaching them that they exist in the world and they need to think the world critically. Now think of it this way. This is happening right now in American schools. If you get a degree in education, what do they teach you? Right? How to perform well within the law in which you are going to educate the children. That's what certifications are for. No one is teaching you as a future educator to think critically of the system in which you will be practicing. And if you don't think critically of the system in which you will be practicing, you will take it to be established immutable, right? That's the point that he's trying to make. Now what else he's trying to so with the problem-posing education, because they are being encouraged and they are learning to think of their place in the world and think of the world critically, then they will start thinking of the objective reality in which they are surrounded. They will start looking at the inequalities, the injustices. They will stop thinking that they have a certain place in the world because it's their own fault or because that's how the world is, but they will start questioning the injustices of that. That is what he's talking about. And then he gives us, this a kind of a tabulated comparison of the banking system. So first of all, what he says is that the banking system mythologizes reality. What does it mean, right? Well, if it mythologizes reality, what it then means is that reality as exists, our place in it is already decided, right? We take it as granted. This is my place in this world. This is who I am. I'm a peasant. I'm a worker, right? And I need to get these skills to succeed in the world. That's the mythologization. It can also be done through ideology, through religion, right? The function of the problem-posing education is to demythologize, to teach, to think critically about ourselves, about the educational materials and the world, and to learn that no, the world as it is, God didn't create this world like that, right? We humans created it. That's the anthropological view of the culture. And if humans have created it, it can be made better. Then he goes, the banking system resists dialogue. It doesn't want a dialogic mode of education, especially a dialogue in which there is a teacher-student correspondence and relationship instead of the hierarchy, right? Because if dialogue is allowed, then the students would be allowed to speak what they think. And so that hierarchy, established hierarchy, will be disturbed. So that's why the problem-solving or problem-posing system encourages dialogue, a conversation. Now we already know that the banking system treats students as objects of assistance. These are the people they don't know. We ought to teach them. We ought to cater to them, right? And in that case, they still remain passive, right? The problem-posing system, on the other hand, makes them critical thinkers of what is being taught, but critical thinkers by extension of the world in which they live. Because remember, the consciousness and the world go hand in hand. One determines the other determines one back. There is no first consciousness, then the world, right? And there can be no world without consciousness anyway, because as we learned, no one will be there to talk about it. Then, the banking system, of course, we already know inhibits creativity, right? And domesticates thought. Inhibits creativity how? By just teaching the text and encouraging students to just master that and not relate the text to the world or to their own lives, right? And not to question it. And that is an act of domestication, because you're just mastering the text and reproducing it. The problem-posing education, according to what we just read, bases itself on creativity and stimulates true reflection and action upon reality, because it is encouraging people to think critical of themselves, of the materials, and of the reality. They then start believing that reality is not immutable, it is not ossified, it is not etched on stone. It can be transformed, and that they have the power to transform it. But in order to think that, they first have to at least make an attempt to think that what is being taught to them, they have a say in receiving it, they have a say in challenging its assumptions, right? So the beginning is all critical thinking. And finally, what he says is that the banking system fails to acknowledge men and women as historical beings. What does it mean? By insisting that here are certain knowledges that we need to impart to everyone within this school system, and if they master it, they would become cogs in whatever capitalistic machine they work. What is eliminated in the process, that men and women can have particular historical experiences, and that if they are historical beings, then they are agents, and if they are agents, they can change the world in which they live. That possibility doesn't exist in the banking system, because all we are producing in the banking systems are people with sufficient skills to function in the world as objects, right? As those who perform certain tasks and don't have any volition beyond that. The problem-posing education takes the people's historicity as their starting point. Why? Because people exist in history. They exist in the world. So when we educate, when we co-learn, first and foremost, we relate the learning experience to the world in which students live, in which teachers live, so that they can think of it contingently, because only then they can learn of their own exploitation. Now, slightly on a side note, how it was done. I mean, think of the colonies, the former colonies. And I have several lectures on the educational system there. People were being trained to be good clerks. They were being trained to reproduce things, but also they were being taught things that were totally detached from their reality. You know, every student from the former British Empire had to learn Wordsworth's daffodils. Daffodils don't grow, in Pakistan. Now they grow because people transplanted them. So what was happening was they were learning aesthetically to love a flower that they had no idea about. How would we make that more pertinent to the students, right? By teaching them about poems about the flowers in their own country, by showing them what beautiful things exist in their own culture, right? Now that would make them think of their world, that things that are growing around their villages, that their mothers and grandmothers plant, are also beautiful, right? And that would make them reflect on the world in which they exist. But the banking system would make the mastery of a foreign poem about an exotic flower in itself an activity worthy of reproduction in an exam, in a test, right? And that's what if your upward mobility is connected to learning things that have nothing to say about your culture, then one chance is you will not think critically of your own life because you're too busy learning the ways of the masters so that you can rise. These are some of the things that he's talking about. We are approaching the end of the chapter, right? And now we are getting a clear comparison of the banking system and its ramifications, right? And the possibilities of the problem-posing education. So I will now read the last paragraph of chapter 2 and then come back and conclude our conversation. Problem-posing education affirms men and women as beings in the process of becoming, as unfinished, uncompleted beings in and with a likewise unfinished reality. Indeed, in contrast to other animals who are unfinished but not historical, people know themselves to be unfinished. They are aware of their incompletion. In this incompletion and this awareness lie the very roots of education as an exclusively human manifestation. The unfinished character of human beings and the transformational character of reality necessitate that education be an ongoing activity. Education is thus constantly remade in the praxis. In order to be, it must become. Its duration, in the Bergsonian meaning of the word, is found in the interplay of the opposites, permanence and change. The banking method emphasizes permanence and becomes reactionary. Problem-posing education, which accepts neither a well-behaved present nor a predetermined future, roots itself in the dynamic present and becomes revolutionary. Problem-posing education is revolutionary futurity. Hence, it is a prophetic and as such hopeful. Hence, it corresponds to the historical nature of humankind. Hence, it affirms women and men as beings who transcend themselves, who move forward and look ahead, for whom immobility represents a fatal threat, for whom looking at the past must only be a means of understanding more clearly what and who they are so that they can more wisely build the future. Hence, it identifies with the movement which engages people as beings aware of their incompletion, an historical movement which has its point of departure, its subjects, and its objective. The point of departure of the movement lies in the people themselves. But since people do not exist apart from the world, apart from reality, the movement must begin with the human-world relationship. Accordingly, the point of departure must always be with men and women in the here and now, which constitutes the situation within which they are submerged, from which they emerge and in which they intervene. Only by starting from this situation, which determines their perception of it, can they begin to move. To do this authentically, they must perceive their state not as fated and unalterable, but merely as limiting and therefore challenging. So my apologies, this wasn't the last reading. There will be one more reading, but let's talk about what I just read. So let's first clarify a little about what he means by duration, which he's using from Henri Bergson, right? The famous philosopher of time, right? Besides other things. According to Bergson, duration is the succession of qualitatively heterogeneous physical states, all melting together in a unity which nonetheless discloses intensive multiplicity and thus is not static. So what the meaning is that the problem-posing education does not imagine either a temporal staticness, right, permanence, or a physical spatial completeness or permanence. Since we exist in time and time is constantly moving, right, we cannot assume that the reality is fixed and all we need to do is learn a little bit. No. We must know that we exist in time, and since we exist in time, as students, as teachers, change is possible in that duration. Time is duration, right? 2 is the question of selfhood. And that's a big question in critical pedagogy. I have a lecture on entity theory versus identity in flux and how it has an impact on teaching. You can watch it later, okay? But what he's trying to say is that the banking system would have us believe that we are complete in ourselves. Because if we buy into that idea, then if we are completed entities, then our identity is fixed. And if our identity is fixed, then if I'm a peasant, I'm a peasant. I can't change that, right? If I'm a worker, I'm a worker. I can't change that. If I will accept the permanence of my own social identity as fixed, as lapidary, as etched, then I will also buy into the hierarchy that exists, right? So we exist in time, and things change in time because things are not immutable. They are in a movement, right? 2, there is a possibility that we constantly can change ourselves and renew ourselves. And that is part of the problem posing education, because if we can believe that we can change ourselves, only then critical inquiry can first enable us to think our own location. Then that belief in non-permanence of identity in flux with the possibility of change in time, will then encourage us to change the world around us and change our own place in it. While the banking system, according to Freire, doesn't encourage that because it discourages critical thinking and forces in a way, or encourages us to think that things are as they are, by focusing more on impermanence and movement of time, and by realizing that we are constantly seeking our betterment. We are not complete, and the more we work on the self in the world, the better we get. Then we get a kind of pedagogy that enables people to think through the reality in which they exist, try to change it, but also try to change themselves. This is what I understand by this passage and by emphasis on change and the possibility of change in the problem-posing education. Now let's go and read the concluding paragraph, and then I will sum up this conversation, which is already getting a bit too long. Whereas the banking method directly or indirectly reinforces men's fatalistic perception of their situation, the problem-posing method presents this very situation to them as a problem. As the situation becomes the object of their cognition, the naive or magical perception which produced their fatalism gives way to perception which is able to perceive itself even as it perceives reality, and can thus be critically objective about that reality. A deepened consciousness of their situation leads people to apprehend that situation as an historical reality susceptible of transformation. Resignation gives way to the drive for transformation and inquiry, over which men feel themselves to be in control. If people, as historical beings necessarily engaged with other peoples in a movement of inquiry, did not control that movement, it would be and is a violation of their humanity. Any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. The means used are not important. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to change them into objects. This movement of inquiry must be directed towards humanization, the people's historical vocation. The pursuit of full humanity, however, cannot be carried out in isolation or individualism, but only in fellowship and solidarity. Therefore, it cannot unfold in the antagonistic relations between oppressors and oppressed. No one can be authentically human while he prevents others from being so. Attempting to be more human individualistically leads to having more, egotistically a form of dehumanization. Not that it is not fundamental to have in order to be human. Precisely because it is necessary, some men's having must not be allowed to constitute an obstacle to others' having, must not consolidate the power of the former to crush the latter. Problem-posing education as a humanist and liberating praxis posits as fundamental that the people subjected to domination must fight for their emancipation. To that end, it enables teachers and students to become subjects of the educational process by overcoming authoritarianism and an alienating intellectualism. It also enables people to overcome their false perception of reality. The world, no longer something to be described with deceptive words, becomes the object of that transforming action by men and women which results in their humanization. Problem-posing education does not and cannot serve the interests of the oppressor. No oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question why. While only a revolutionary society can carry out this education in systematic terms, the revolutionary leaders need not take full power before they can employ the method. In the revolutionary process, the leaders cannot utilize the banking method as an interim measure justified on grounds of expediency with the intention of later behaving in a genuinely revolutionary fashion. They must be revolutionary, that is to say, dialogical from the outset. So thus, we reach the profound ending of probably the most important chapter in the pedagogy of the oppressed. The question still is full realization of one's humanity, right? And what he's trying to say is that in the process of employing problem-posing or problem-solving education, we overcome fatalism. Now, we talked about it. Fatalism can only occur when we buy into our existing situation uncritically as unchanging. That's why there was that emphasis on change and on living in history, right? And that in the process then, the students or those learning then become subjects. They become subjects because they participate in their own education and they are not passive recipients. And we must also protect against authoritarianism, which we already assign to the dominant group, right, who own the banking system. But also there is an instructive term here, alienating intellectualism. That's the discourse of the master. That we as professors, right, as knowing stuff, can also become, and often do, partners in perpetuating the oppressive order by just performing this identity where we top down give our knowledge to our students. They must be participants in their education. And then the most important thing, which he had also previously talked about, is that the problem-posing education is a revolutionary mode of education. But it cannot wait until the revolution has happened, because it has a role to play in creating that revolutionary identity, right? So the leaders of a revolution, first of all, cannot rely on the banking system, but cannot also just keep saying that when we have won, we will start this new system. No. They must be committed to it informally, if not formally, to practice the problem-posing education, right? They can't postpone it to a future yet to come, right? Because they must be committed to this revolutionary and dialogical form from the outset. And there is a reason for it, and the reason is pedagogical. We cannot make people active participants in revolutionary change, in changing the world in which they live and transforming it, we cannot expect them to not become oppressors themselves and hence dehumanize themselves in the process of revolution if they have not taught themselves through a teacher-student relationship in the problem-posing education to learn to express their humanity, to transform the world, right? That is the danger. If we transpose it to a future yet to come, then we'll bring about a revolution that will perpetuate the same order that you've just overthrown. That's the point of problem-posing education. That's the point of critical pedagogy. So we started this chapter 2, with a detailed description of the banking system of education, the main crux of which is that in the banking system of education there is no critical thought. The teacher-student have a hierarchical relationship. Knowledge is passed down to the student. They are passive recipients into which the knowledge is deposited. Then he explains to us what are the dangers of that, right? That it does not allow for critical thought. And if there is no critical thought, people will not think of their own world critically. Then he teaches us that people usually intuitively know the structures within which they exist. The question is to come up with a system of pedagogy that encourages thinking the world, that connects them to the world, right? And then helps them think that world critically. After they've thought of themselves critically, of the materials that are being taught critically, have had a dialogue with the teacher as equals, and thought the world critically, is then they will develop a praxis of liberation. That praxis of liberation from the very start must be committed to the full humanization of every individual in the revolutionary process. From the start, that cannot be delayed until the revolution has happened. So these are some of the things that are included in Chapter 2. I have tried to cover them as best as I can. I again apologize for the pedagogical medium that I am using because we're talking about learning together, but here I am lecturing through a video, but that cannot be helped. I'm still trying to share my ideas, and I hope to hear from you. The best way you can make this more dialogic is by commenting on these videos and by watching all the videos on this subject. Now what I will do after this, posting this video, is I will combine all the video lectures and conversations, let's not call them lectures, in one and upload it so that if you want to watch them in one go without interruptions, you can do that. It would be pretty long, but that's my plan. And then maybe I will now start recording Chapter 3. I don't have a definite plan, but you will start seeing the videos for Chapter 3. I do encourage you to watch them from beginning to the end. And the list would come up, and just click on it and see what if you want to watch them sequentially. That's all. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you next time. And until then, as always, peace and love.